Tim's going to come and speak to us later, us grown-ups, about the Beatitudes. Now, depending on which type of Google or Wikipedia you look at, a beatitude is an attitude. It's also a blessing. That's the word I was looking for, but it is a beautiful attitude. A blessing. And what is a blessing? Something nice, a gift. Now, Hope, what happens this week on Friday? What's happening on Saturday? Mo's birthday. It's not, he's just guessed it's her birthday. Hope's party on Saturday. And Hope, I'm sure, are you hoping for nice things? And presents? No, it's gone over, that's it. Do you want presents at your party? You want your friends? Oh, no, someone's taken the toy that she put. Oh, anyway, she's going to get presents and gifts and blessings. You're going to have lots of nice things at your party. And friends to come and see you. Is Amelia coming? Possibly. We'll go on. Yes. Okay. Sometimes when we receive presents, they're not always the things that we want or the things that we like. And we've done a little bit about that before, where you had to open things, didn't you, Bradley? And then the rubber gloves weren't any use to you, were they at all? But you had to go and use them for helping somebody else. So, we sometimes... He has. He's such a good lad. He really is. Does he do the dishes, Megan? Where's Megan? No. Did you give the rubber gloves away then? Yeah, okay. 3 sets of 2. So both beneath them, I need you to help. Yeah. Megan and Lorenzo, you come and stand here a minute. That's it. Okay, what do you need? Hope to look at Lorenzo. Hope to look at Ethan. Lorenzo? I want you to look at Megan. That's it. And then, Carly and Joanne. Oh, she said, what? Did you look at Carly? Come around this way, something like that. That's all right, that's fine. Okay, so we're going to throw the ball to our friend, and our friend's going to catch it. 1, 2, 3, go! Let's see. Okay, now I want you to take a step backwards this side. Do a step backwards and have another go. 1, 2, 3. Catch Ethan's ball. Catch! Right, then pass it back, and then go back a bit. You've got to go back a bit further. That's it. A bit further. Oh, ready? There we go. Ready to catch. Okay. Well, Ethan, throw it home. And then, can you go back a bit further? Back to the church to run. Sorry, It was harder the further away you got. Now, I want you to think about how close we are to God. Because when we're close to God, it's probably easier to get those gifts and those blessings. The further we go away from God, it's harder to receive those blessings that he has. He has loads of blessings there for us. We just have to look at him and take them. So remember, get close and then you'll get the blessing.
Good morning again from me. Nice to be with you and to worship God. Can I just move this back a bit? Is that all right, Tim? Because just a bit in the way a bit, and I've got my other one on. So that's better. I can see the scriptures. It's always a good thing, isn't it? Been asked to look at the Beatitudes today. Blessed ones, or the Beatitudes. I'll cast my verdict in a while. So I'm just going to ask you as I read them to you. They may be famous and familiar words, but they are the first sermon Jesus ever preached. And he preached loads more than just these little sayings. There was just the opening bit. So if you like to use your imagination, just cast your imagination onto a lovely sunny hillside. That's good for the imagination today, isn't it? In the Middle East, as you look down on a beautiful glistening lake, the Lake of Galilee, and you're up on the mountainside, and you've followed Jesus up there. He's taken his 12. You're just a bit curious what he wants to say to them. So you're listening in. Where I come in from the world, you'd be tab hanging. Do you know that word? Hanging your ears out. Because you're listening and you hear these words. And just try to pretend you have never heard these words before. So they're completely new. And as you're imagining, just imagine how you're feeling. Good or bad. Okay? When he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's a bag of mixed blessings, isn't it? Some years ago, I preached a series of sermons on the Beatitudes. These short, brief statements of Jesus at the so-called start of the Sermon on the Mount. And today I've been asked to look at all of them in one session. And as a preacher, I often just like to reflect on whether I've done things the best way and how things could be improved or changed. And I actually think that in one sense, today is more appropriate. We do, as preachers, and therefore those of us who listen to preachers as well, in our culture and our background of preaching, it's kind of almost looking for every needle in every haystack. You know, breaking a text down, and there's so many aspects to it and so forth. But sometimes it's actually good to take a broad overview. So these Beatitudes, these short statements, are written in a rhythmical way. You can almost read them like poetry, can't you, as you read them, with a broadly standard pattern. It's a statement of blessing for a characteristic, and then some kind of reward, now or future, that goes with it. And it seems to me, given this is Jesus' first part of his first sermon, you probably all know that you don't remember everything. You probably only remember a fraction of a sermon. And Jesus starts with these punchy, rhythmical, short statements in the Greek text, which wasn't what Jesus used, but the first 4 happen to be all words that start with the same letter. And you know what preachers are good at, don't you? Trying to match up the letters to give you something to remind you of key points. Well, that's traditionally how preachers have tended to preach, but it may not always be appropriate. And sometimes it's very contorted, isn't it? You think, oh, you've dragged that one out to make the letter right, or whatever. But there's something about these Beatitudes that are quick, easy, and memorable. And sometimes we do best not to kind of dig too deeply into the intricacies of them, but just take them as they stand. And that's why I asked you just to listen to them and imagine hearing them for the first time. Clearly, these sayings of Jesus took root quickly, and I don't just mean in his earthly lifetime, but there's a church on the very hillside I've tried to imagine, which has been recovered from the ground via archaeology, obviously, and it has the shape of an octagon. So that black line encircling those 8 characteristics in the Beatitudes. And the thought is that this early church was built about that place. We don't know exactly where Jesus stood and so forth, but at that place, let's assume it to be the site where Jesus preached his first sermon, and it was built, this church, to reflect the Beatitudes so much because the perception was these are really important. 8 characteristics. Now, we get into the adult version. The Beatitudes, that's what we take them to be. That's the title in your church Bible. These 8 things which start with the word blessed. Now, blessed is an odd word, isn't it? To be really adult, it's got a wide semantic field. Yeah, which means, which I'm just joking around, which basically means it's got a big range of meanings, like lots of words. So, if you were told as a child, "I'll bless you," you probably didn't take it as a nice comment, did you? Exactly. And I remember saying something to somebody once, semi-pastorally, really, and I told them something. They said, "Oh, bless." And I thought, basically, they kind of seemed to be saying to me, "Oh, how cute you are." "Oh, bless you." And we have this whole range of meaning in society of what it means to bless or to be blessed. In the Bible, it means to be blessed of God, which just means, as Ruth said, somehow prospered in a more adult language, somehow given things of God. We are blessed, we are privileged to be his children, and so forth. So it ranges from a characteristic of God through to how we are before God as his people, through to a casual statement of, "Oh, you're cute," or kind of, well, the other one is really basically, "I'll swing for you," isn't it? Bless you, whatever, in bygone days. So there's this whole range of meanings to it. Now, the word beatitude comes straight out of the Latin, as you'll all know. Beatus means blessed. It means fortunate. It means privileged. And just to widen it and to put a bit more body on it, the same word in the New Testament that is used for the word blessed here in Matthew and by Luke, it also happens to be used in the book of Acts, which struck me as a useful example. And it's in Acts 26 when Paul was on trial. Now, that's not a happy place to be, is it? He's defending his life, he's defending his faith, he's defending his mission before a pagan king called Agrippa. And Paul says to Agrippa, "I consider myself," and our translation is, "fortunate to stand before you today and make my defense." Now, what that could be translated is, "I consider myself blessed to stand before you and defend my faith." Now, we wouldn't think that's a blessed position, would we? I think if I were Paul and I was going to have to stand before the authorities and justify why I'm a preacher, you probably wouldn't be praying, Lord, thank you, you have blessed him. You'd probably be saying, Lord, get him out of there safely. Don't let him be punished because he's a preacher and he's coming on Sunday and we'll have a gap otherwise. No. Do you see what I mean? It's not the average kind of area where we would think, oh, that's a real position of blessing. And Paul, later on to Timothy, speaks of the glorious gospel of the blessed God. So, because God is so blessed, and in that sense it just means privileged beyond us. He's so other than we are. Because of his position of being blessed, Paul is effectively saying the glorious gospel comes as a blessing to us. So it really means something like being in a good position, being in a good place under God. The 8-week series that I preached on the Beatitudes, I called The Good Life. Now that's sent your imaginations elsewhere, hasn't it? And to neighbours and so forth. But it's the good life because this is the good life under a good God. One of my first Bible college lecturers, now with the Lord, put it in a commentary, that this is someone to be congratulated, someone who is well off. And you know very well that some of the things that we read and you listened to in those 8 statements don't make you feel as though you're very well off. And in fact, we don't like that phrase well off, do we? If I say to you, are you well off? You probably assume, does he think I've got a lot of money? I'm fortunate in the earthly sense of the word because I'm rich. And how often, I wonder, you don't need to put your hands up to answer this, how often have you said to somebody, well, we're not very well off? Because we don't like the idea of making out that we're rich and we're prosperous. But guess what, folks? As the children of God, we're the most prosperous, wealthy, fortunate people in the world, are we not? So we are well off. One particular dictionary describes this word as pertaining to being happy with the implication of enjoying favourable circumstances. Now, folks, are you well off? Yes. Are you happy with fortunate circumstances? Oh, gosh, it was a bit tentative, but it was more than I expected. Because actually, we quite often talk about being a Christian is hard work, there's suffering, there's persecution, there's mockery. God doesn't always answer our prayers as we want. So, frankly, folks, we don't always feel well off, although you know the right answer. That's true, isn't it, I think? That we know we are well off, and yet life, actually, I would have to say, in all honesty, and you can sack me from preaching again if you want, but I would have to say to you that my life has been so much more complicated, awkward, puzzling and frustrating because I gave my heart to the Lord. Because life is not as straightforward. It's dead easy, with a dead result, of course, to live your life your own way, where the pattern of life is you grow up, you do whatever you do, you try to earn as much money as you can, as much status as you can, get all the accoutrements you can, and that will be the good life. Much like that TV program, 2 opposites of what is the good life. One is to do all that, and the neighbours is, we just want a good life that is simple. So they were kind of like going against the grain, and all the fun in that program was the friction of the 2 ways of life. Well, actually, that is true from Christianity, isn't it? That when we go against the grain and say we don't want to live for that, we want to live by Jesus' standards, then there's friction. So although it's the good life, it doesn't always feel like the good life. And I'm a great advocate for saying, as Christians, let's not just pretend everything is glamorous and good. Let's be real about it. Let's recognize we have an ambivalence. We live privileged life as children of God, but it also brings frustrations. And folks, surprise, surprise, we are straight back into the Beatitudes. Two very important things just to note. People don't always appear happy in this world. These people, the people Jesus is speaking of, and the first disciples, he could have lost a few along the way after his first introduction to his first sermon, couldn't he? I'm not sure I want this. By definition, poor people are not happy people in the way of the world, because we prayed earlier and we thank God for our homes, our food, and our health, or the lack of it. But it's not always happy to be without things, and poverty is to be without things, whether it's God or the trappings of the world. So the poor are not generally happy. By definition, those who mourn definitely aren't happy. That's what mourning means, isn't it? It means being grief-stricken. It means being sad. It means being heartbroken. So how can you say the heartbroken are happy? Well, you can if you believe in the ambivalence that I'm talking about, that the circumstances of life, personally, and the world around you can break your heart. But you can still be blessed because God pours his blessing over, above, despite all those things. And that's before we've got to those who are persecuted. So that's really important. To be happy before God is not the same as being happy in the world. And secondly, note that the rewards spelled out in these Beatitudes, in the second part of each Beatitude, are largely written in the future tense. They will, whatever. So there's a perspective here where don't judge the good life by how it feels at the moment. The trouble is, if you have a roller coaster life, your good life and a bad life can change 36 times in a day or whatever, if it goes by the swings of happiness and sadness. And the rewards are largely written in the future tense, except the first and the last. If you look at them, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is already here for those who are poor in spirit. And the last one, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I just think it's wonderfully pictorial that the first and last are firmly set in this world. God's kingdom is here, and yet the other six are all to be waited for. Usefully neat as a preacher to the master preacher. There is captured that this has already started, and yet there is so much more to come. So it's a good place to be and a bad place to be at the same time. How can this be? How can things be good and bad at the same time? And the illustration that popped into my mind was, judging from the prayers, there's a lot of people and a lot of interaction with hospitals in your church. In every church. But there's that interaction. But the image of a hospital, is it a good place to be or a bad place to be? Go on, you know the answer, don't you? It's both. Absolutely. It's a bad place to be because you don't visit a hospital unless you're ill or you're visiting somebody who is ill. That's what they're for. So they're a bad place. But it's a wonderful place to be because actually it's the best place to be if you're ill enough to be declared necessary to be in a hospital. So it's bad and it's good at the same time. So for me, that just satisfies my sense of the challenge of these Beatitudes, this wonderful place, this privileged place, and yet not always a happy place. But the two places are not home or hospital, but they're earth and heaven. The kingdom of heaven is stated as being here right now. There it is, verse 3 again. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the other place, but it coexists with this world at the moment. And these people who are blessed, verse 5, they will inherit the earth. Not just that they're citizens of heaven, but they'll inherit the earth. That earth, by definition of inheritance, is not yet here. And Peter, later on in his epistle says, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth. Again, it's the present and the future. Heaven and earth, all wrapped into one in these corporate statements. And back to Paul, before Agrippa, he was blessed, but he was still in the real world, the current world of power and politics. And yet he, single-handedly under God, was the primary human resource after Jesus himself brought in the kingdom of God to establish God's kingdom on earth by traveling around and establishing churches. So he was on that intersection between heaven and earth, between the present and the future. He said to one of his first church in Europe, Philippi, I long to depart and be with the Lord, but it's better for you that I stay here. You see? So he knew all this interaction, the two worlds he lived in, and the two time zones, now and the future. And we always live in the same place. Which brings me back to the start. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountainside, sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. To the disciples, those who've entered something new. This is not a general moral high point of how we ought to be living. Good Beatitudes, and I've heard that before, Beatitudes is a good English way of saying it's be of this attitude. That's true in its own way, but that just happens to be an English quirky way of kind of connecting the word up. But actually, the Beatitude is to be blessed before God in this world. And you cannot create that attitude just as a human being. These are not just morally good things to live like, although they would serve well as that. But you can't see it in that context because actually it's poor in spirit. And to be in spirit connects with God. You could be persecuted for other faiths, but in case here, it's because of your Christian faith. So this is a new kingdom with new attitudes, albeit. But actually, it's the state of being privileged before God. And that is what Jesus is saying to the disciples. This is a new kingdom. This is completely different. This is a kingdom that turns everything upside down. And just to draw to a close and think about that, let's look at Matthew's gospel so far and compare it to the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus was born as a Jew and he came into the Jewish world and he changed it. He moved on everything that it was to point to, and he brought in what we would call the Christian world, and setting out to come to the Beatitudes where Jesus had come from in Matthew's gospel. Whistle-stop tour of four chapters. Jesus is born. You know that bit, don't you? We've only not long since had Christmas, and we think of the coming of Jesus. And just as Jesus was born, so the Old Testament people of God were born. Jacob was born, and he was renamed Israel, and Israel became the people of God. Jesus, like Israel, was born into this world. Jesus was exiled to Egypt and came out. And, of course, Israel was exiled to Egypt in the sense that they went there because they needed Pharaoh and his grain and so forth. And God then brought them out. So they both came out of Egypt. Matthew's gospel particularly reports that Jesus went to Egypt to avoid death. And he came back out of Israel. Out of Egypt, I call my son. Matthew quotes that. So he makes the link between Jesus and Israel are both born. Jesus spent time in the wilderness, 40 days. Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. There's a parallel there. Jesus entered and came out of the waters of Jordan when he was baptized. Israel entered the Jordan and came out to come into their inheritance, Israel. When Israel were about to enter the land, God gave them a solemn covenant. And you can read about it in the Old Testament. And it talks about blessings and curses. Do this, you will live. Do this, and you won't live as you're supposed to live before me. Jesus came with his covenant, but it was only blessings. And these are the Beatitudes that start out the blessings of this new covenant. There are no curses in this new covenant. If you're astute, you may know that Luke also has a version of the Beatitudes, and he has curses and woes. But the woes are not for failing to do the blessings. The woes are for those who never come into the blessings. So there's a noticeable difference there. Jesus has not come to curse. He has come to say, I give you the privilege of being one of mine. I give you the fortune of heaven to have all blessings, no curses. So there's this parallel between Jesus as the new Israel, and this is what he's come to bring. And you know, those words from that mountainside 2,000 years ago are as true today as they were then. See, you can't argue this. We all live on the same earth. Anybody not live on it? We all live on the same earth, which even those who are not Christians recognize is an unhappy place. Whether it's coronavirus, or whether it's political maneuverings, or whether it is personal sadness, even as we've seen this weekend, that we build people up on a pedestal of the media and popularity, and then we can't believe it when they fall off. And we live in this fallen world. We all live in one place, which certainly, if you just take an average scan of the news headlines, is more about misery than joy. You don't hear about much joy in life, do you? You've got to find your own joy, and you won't find your joy suddenly becomes national headlines, unless there's a scandal in it. So we live in the same world, and Jesus comes to us who live in this world, and he says, you can have the good life. Not a good life, the good life. You can be congratulated for who you are and what you are. You can have the fortune of heaven to live by. And if we're Christians, we live in that world too. We don't escape the other world, but we live in that one too. And guess what, folks? Hard challenge for you to work out which one wins. The future one wins, doesn't it? But it's the future that's already here. The kingdom of God, the new heaven and the new earth. The big question is not how we live on this earth, although that's important. The big question is, are we currently living in the heavenly world? What does Paul say to the Colossians? Set your minds on things above, where Christ sits at the right hand of God. If you do that today for the first time, you have got all the congratulations of heaven calling down to you, serenading you in a way that no birthday party congratulations could ever even scratch the surface of. Because heaven rejoices, as Jesus said, in one sinner who repents. Or to put it in more kind of modern language, to one person who changes their citizenship from simply the earthly kingdom to the heavenly kingdom. We will inherit the earth. Not one saved by ourselves, as the modern world seems to think it needs to do. We can try and do certain bits to save ourselves, but it won't ultimately work. The only thing that will save this world is the return of Jesus in glory to bring heaven and earth into one eternal place. So can I ask you, and particularly as we come to the communion table, because this is crucial for us to turn to communion, are you living in the other world? Because bluntly, and I don't mean this legalistically, you can't truly take communion unless you're living in the other world. Otherwise, it's just an act you're going through. We do it because we're saying to God, we are blessed. We are fortunate. We are privileged. There is probably very little that goes higher than the privilege of coming to the communion table this side of eternity. Baptism would come close, but obviously one off as opposed to this. There is little else that we are more privileged to do in our faith as a single act than to come and take the bread and the cup. Can I ask you, are you truly blessed? Are you fundamentally happy in an unhappy world? And you're fundamentally happy because you know the other world. You're assured of the coming day when you'll be fully united with your Lord and your Saviour, and your happiness will be untainted. Are you blessed? Can I pray about that and then we'll move on? Father, I pray that you'll help each one of us to be truly blessed this morning as we meet in your name. Lord, forgive us if we've lost sight of how privileged we are. And Lord, if there is anyone here this morning who hasn't quite grasped what it means to have all the fortune of heaven bestowed upon their lives, I pray today might be that moment. Prepare us as we come to the communion table to see the wonder of what you've done for us and what is yet to come. Amen.